Hey everybody, and welcome to my presentation about my research project. So, we read a lot of interesting text this semester, but in my opinion, one of the most interesting characters that we studied was Margaret Cavendish. Cavendish was kind of an enigma. She was wildly ambitious and hungry for fame and recognition, but a lot of people argue that she didn't really have the talent to back that up. She was really eccentric in her writing and behavior and even the way that she dressed, and she was deeply interested in challenging society's views of women. But at the same time, she was also socially conservative, and she benefited from the society that she criticized. For example, she was harshly critical of the institution of marriage, but by all accounts, she was happily and prosperously married. So these contradictions in herself and her work and just the audacity of everything she did led people to question her personality and her work and even her sanity during her time. But even as researchers now have worked to improve her standing in literary history, there's still debate about the quality of her writing, the validity of her arguments about science and philosophy, and even the authenticity of her challenges of patriarchy. But one thing about Cavendish is certain. She's an author who can't be easily ignored. In fact, she spent her entire lifetime making sure of it. Every endeavor that she took on, writing fiction and poetry, asserting herself into the fields of philosophy and science, insisting on the publication of her works and under her own name, asking challenging questions about how society oppressed women, and writing an autobiography, which is very rare for a woman at the time. All of this was meant to make the declaration that her voice mattered and deserved to be heard. She often said that she wrote because so many other things were denied to women. Society kept a lot from women during her time, but writing was one power that a woman could claim for herself. I think this actually also applies to her pursuit of fame. Cavendish identified a lot of powers that were given to men by society. The opportunities for education, for political power, the opportunity to control their own finances, control their own future, and the opportunity to pursue fame. And of these powers, Cavendish identified the opportunity to pursue fame as one power that a woman could take for herself. And so, just like writing, she pursued it with all of her might. And ultimately, she got what she wanted. But even though she was successful at inserting her name into history, Cavendish's legacy is pretty controversial. There's controversy, there's critique, and even pretty harsh dismissal. Um, there's the famous quote from Virginia Woolf where she calls Cavendish's philosophies futile and her plays intolerable and her verses dull, and she calls her crack-brained and bird-witted. And Woolf had a positive assessment of Cavendish. And this kind of backhanded assessment is fairly common in research about her. No matter how much value a researcher finds in Cavendish's work, there's always this underlying urge to take her down a notch, to not commit too much to praising her, lest you look as foolish as people think Cavendish was. This hedging of bets and this backhanded praise is especially prominent in scholarship about her relationship with feminism. But let's be clear, Cavendish used her fiction and nonfiction writing to ask some pretty serious questions about the role of women in society and the responsibility of patriarchy in denying women the opportunity to achieve their fullest potential. She also lived her entire life in pursuit of authenticating the female voice as something worth listening to, arguing for women to have a place in academia, and even challenging some respected men of her time. And yet, despite all of this, scholars are really reluctant to give her full credit for any of it, and very few are willing to actually call her a feminist, at least not without many caveats. Instead, all arguments about her relationship with feminism focus almost entirely on the apparent contradictions in her work and life. Scholars point out that she was harshly critical of women's capabilities and intelligence, and even occasionally argued that women were naturally inferior to men. They also note that even though her fictional works focus on exploring utopian societies in which women are freed from patriarchy and allowed to flourish, those fictional works tend to end with those utopias collapsing and her female characters rejoining patriarchal society. But the truth underlying all of this is, I think, not as complex as a lot of researchers make it seem. For one thing, first and foremost, while Cavendish did often talk about the weaknesses of women, she was insistent that these weaknesses were the result of women's oppression by society. Over and over again, she argued that the reason why women didn't achieve the same things that men did was because they were denied opportunities and education. She argued that many women may have narrow interests and dull minds, but this was because they never had the chance to put their minds to use. And while a lot is made of her claims that women were naturally inferior to men, which weren't that common, she didn't do that very often, but a lot is made of it. But nevertheless, her entire body of philosophical work, of which there's quite a bit, was all about how nature is malleable and is affected by human forces and culture. But the claim about her that I find the most absurd is the claim that the arguments made in her fictional works are undermined by the fact that her utopian societies ultimately fail. I haven't read all of Cavendish's plays, but I've read a few and I've read analysis of them. And in all of them, her female characters returning to patriarchal society is never depicted as being a triumph. It's always depicted as being a tragedy. Cavendish isn't sending her characters back to the shackles of patriarchy in order to prove that patriarchy is inevitable or good. She's doing it to remind her readers that the reality outside of her fiction remains bleak for women and needs to be changed. After all, this reality is what destroys her utopias. I mean, let's look at Convent of Pleasure. So yes, by the end, Lady Happy marries the prince and gives up her convent and her estate and all of her autonomy. But in the process of this, she also disappears entirely from her own story. She's obliterated by the progression of this plot. At the beginning of the story, her voice is very prominent. She speaks in these long monologues about her views of life and herself and marriage. But as the play progresses and the prince character is introduced, suddenly her voice is going back and forth. She's in dialogues. And then her voice becomes abstracted and becomes poetry. And then by the end of the play, her voice is pretty much gone. The end of the play is handled by a fool, a character who comes in, who just appears out of nowhere in the final act. And, Cavendish was a fan of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare's fools were characters who would hold up a mirror to the protagonists or to the audience. And at the end of Convent of Pleasure, Cavendish brings in a fool to hold up a mirror to Lady Happy and call her a fool. And then this fool goes on to deliver the epilogue. And the epilogue is not some great moral statement, it's just nonsense. Is this really a happy ending? So that brings me to the thesis of my research project. I think that we can classify Cavendish as an early feminist writer, and I think that we can do so without having to qualify our arguments or hedge our bets. I don't think we have to call her incompetent or overly egotistical or self-contradictory. I especially don't think that she was self-contradictory. I think that she was consistent in her claims that women were capable of much more than society gave them credit for or the opportunity to achieve. In fact, I think she spent her entire life trying to use what power she had access to, her power to write and her power to pursue fame. I think she spent her whole life using these powers in order to prove that women deserved more than they got. Her entire writing career and her entire life were arguments for this. So that's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and may Godzilla destroy your homes last.